Hello, everyone. This is Tokyo International University's Global Dialogue, and my name is Sojin Shin. Today, we have a distinguished speaker, Professor Ali Riaz, to listen to his insight about democratic backsliding in Bangladesh. We also have my colleague, Professor Hiroyuki Yamamoto, and Professor Chris Lamont at Tokyo International University. And many students came to our global dialogue session today from Professor Yamamoto's comparative politics class and my introduction to international relations class. Thank you all for coming. We have witnessed many hybrid regimes moving toward authoritarianism, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. How do we explain this regime change? Our speaker today will talk about the case of Bangladesh with the question of en route to authoritarianism. Dr. Ade Riaz is a distinguished professor of political science at Illinois State University, a non-resident senior fellow of Atlantic Council, and the president of the American Institute of Bangladesh Studies. Professor Riaz previously taught at universities in Bangladesh, England, and South Carolina, worked as a broadcast journalist at the BBC in London, and served as a public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars at Washington, D.C. His primary area of research interest include South Asian politics, democratization, violent extremism, political Islam, and Bangladesh politics. Professor Riaz's recent publications include Voting in a Hybrid Regime, Understanding 2018 Bangladesh Election, and an edited volume, Religion and Politics in South Asia. He has also co-edited Political Violence in South Asia. He also has several books in Bengali to his credit, including Nikoj Ganatantra, meaning the missing democracy, and Le Conde, meaning responsibilities of a writer. Before I invited Professor Riaz to the screen, I would like to request the audience to leave comments and questions at the question board or chat board. You can find the Q&A button below your screen. Without further ado, now I invite Professor Riaz to the stage. Professor Riaz, screen is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Sojin Shin. It's a pleasure to be with you all. And thanks to Tokyo International University for giving me this opportunity to talk about the democratic backsliding in Bangladesh. As you can understand, and many of you are familiar with the situation that is global, that we are witnessing a number of countries which have in the past decade or so have started to digress or regress from democracy. Many authors have described it differently, and some call it autocratization, some call it democratic backsliding, some call it democratic reversal. I have adopted the term democratic backsliding, and today I'm going to talk about how Bangladesh reached today's situation and subsequently is going to be a major area of concern with respect to this democratic backsliding. So let me start with what I mean by democratic backsliding. The definition that I have adopted is from Nancy Berman. She has explained this as a democratic backsliding as the state-led debilitation or elimination of the political institution sustaining in existing democracy. That implies that the countries that we are looking into fall within this definition are those which have experienced or at least had democracy in some form. This is a global phenomenon, as I said, over the past 15 to 16 years, as many of these international organizations, such as Freedom House, Varieties of Democracy, and Economist Intelligence Unit have shown that many countries are in the path to this democratic backsliding. Given this global phenomena, there have been not only interest, there have been effort to explain it. Two central questions that have been at the heart of this endeavor to understand this phenomena is, why does democracy backslide? And how does this process unfold? So these two central questions, if you could move on to the next slide, please. Why does democracy backslide, and how does the process unfold? Because one points to the causes of and conditions for the democratic backsliding, how the democratic institutions, state-led democratic debilitation of the state happens, and how this process actually unfolds is the process issue. In these endeavors, most of the studies that we have seen so far actually addresses the issue of why democracy backslides. Countries such as Turkey, or for that matter, in case of even Hungary, we have seen this kind of endeavor. And there are other countries too which have been addressed too with this question, why does democracy backslide? In many instances, it has been argued that it is largely because of the situation within the countries, that is, rise of the economic situation. In many cases, it has been argued that since the middle class have been diminished, or in say, for example, in case of Europe, we have seen that large number of the people who belong to middle class have increasingly under economic pressure been disillusioned by democracy and have lost trust in the democratic institution. So that is how it has been described and analyzed in many cases, although it is not true in all instances. What I'm trying to get at is that while there have been discussion about why democracy backslides, there have been very few studies which have looked into how it the process unfolds, and gradually a country even from semblance of democracy gradually turns out to be a hybrid regime, that is, where there are democratic institutions. Apparently there are democratic institutions such as regular elections, but essentially the fundamental elements of democracy, for example, human rights situation, deteriorates, right to freedom of expression is deteriorated. Those sort of things that creates this hybrid regime. There are two aspects, as I have mentioned in the next slide. In these conversations, most of the time, people have looked into the institutional aspect. That is, how the elections have been manipulated, how institutions such as judiciary has been influenced. Those sort of things have been explained. So most of the time, we have looked into the institutions such as executive branches aggrandizement, power grabbing, legislative bodies weaknesses. We have also looked into the judiciary's compliance with this kind of thing. But this is not the only aspect. In terms of understanding the democratic backsliding, we also need to look beyond the institutional dimension. When I say beyond the institutional dimension, what I mean is ideological one, how it is justified. So despite the fact that there has been extensive studies on the recent decade, particularly in the past 5 years, that we have seen regarding the democratic backsliding, we haven't seen much of the studies that have looked beyond the institutional dimension. Today, when I'm going to talk about Bangladesh, I'm going to make my case in two steps. As I have mentioned in the next slide, that these two steps that I'm going to talk today as to how Bangladesh have come into or transformed into an hybrid regime. That is where we see the elections taking place regularly. We have seen two consecutive elections in 2014 and 2018, which are seriously flawed and have been described as fraudulent ones. New York Times has described one of these elections as a farcical election. So the first thing that I'm going to do, I would explain to you as to how progressively these democracy has been in recent years attenuated, weakened, and gradually have become so weak that we are calling it as a hybrid regime. The second thing that I'm going to do is identify the particular steps taken by the incumbent. And when I say incumbent, in large measure, I'm going to look from 1991, let's focus on post 2008, from 2009 to 2022, as of today, how the incumbent in the past decade, which transformed the country from an electoral democracy, where election takes place and democracy's central element has become the election, to an electoral authoritarian system, where the authoritarian practices are rampant, yet those who are in the power comes through the election. Bangladesh is not an exceptional situation. It is rather pretty much in line or consistent with others. Turkey is a case in point that we have seen. Hungary is a case in point that we have seen. Venezuela under Chavez, we have seen that kind of thing. So it is not an exceptional situation, but I would look into the Bangladesh and Bangladesh history, particularly looking at the steps taken by the incumbent. That is Bangladesh Awami League, which came into power in 2008 election and have been in power since 2009 January. Since then, 2 elections have taken place in 2014 and 2018, which has delivered victory. So in order to put this discussion into the context, as I have put these 3 phases of governance of Bangladesh, in the next slide that I have explained that Bangladesh's current situation or the current system of governance need to be contextualized. Within this, what I described between 1972 and 1990 as the era of civilian and military authoritarianism. The reason I call it as civilian and military authoritarianism is that Bangladesh became independent in 1971. Previously, it was part of Pakistan for 23 years between 47 and 1971. After the War of Independence, Bangladesh emerged as an independent country in late 1971 in December. And between 72 and 75, Bangladesh was ruled by a civilian government. But in 1975, January, Bangladesh turned into a one-party state. An elected government led by the founder President Sheikh Mujibur Rahman introduced a one-party system. However, unfortunately and very brutally and tragically, he was killed with his family except 2 of his daughters and his close associate in a military coup in August 1975, and Bangladesh entered into a military rule. This continued until 1990, despite the fact that it was one of the military rulers who became president, Ziaur Rahman, was assassinated in 1981. However, Bangladesh experienced another military rule starting in March 1982, which continued until 1990, when a popular uprising unseated General H.M.S. Shah. So between 1972 to 1990, I call them as a civilian and military authoritarianism because civilian government, even in 1975, introduced one-party system, which cannot be considered as a democracy. And of course, the military rule between 75 and 1990, however they wrapped it around with civilianization, it is not a it is not a democratic government, rather an authoritarian one. The second phase of Bangladesh history begins with the 1990. After the popular uprising, Bangladesh actually embarked on a democratic journey. It turned from a presidential system, which was introduced in 1975, to a parliamentary system. And the elections were conducted in 1991, 96, and 2001, and later in 2006, there was a scheduled election. There was, in between, a very unfortunate effort of the then incumbent Bangladesh Nationalist Party to manipulate the election, which was thrown away. Nevertheless, between 1990 and 2006, what we saw is the beginning of a democratic journey, but increasingly it eroded, and eventually in 2006, 2 major political parties, that is Bangladesh Awami League and Bangladesh Nationalist Party, could not come to an understanding of holding an election, which led to the intervention of military. In this instance, in 2007, when military intervened into the politics, they didn't intervene as a ruler, meaning that it was not a direct military rule, but it was a soft coup, meaning they were behind the scene, controlling and dictating and influencing a civilian government. a caretaker civilian government which ruled for 2 years. During this, the democratic erosion that we saw between 1990 and 2006 seems to have been accelerated. After 2 years of this caretaker, military-backed technocratic government, they held an election in 2008 and a new era began in 2009. In the election, Bangladesh Awami League, led by Sheikh Hasina, won the election, and it's a major victory because it delivered more than two-thirds seats of the parliament. And by then, Bangladesh, of course, was a parliamentary system. That means that the power seems to be with the prime minister. It continued, and this is the time I call it that Bangladesh entered into electoral democracy. But over the period, it eroded, and eventually by 2022, we can call it as an electoral authoritarianism. The pathway of Bangladesh, as I have tried to explain in my next slide, if you look at it, what you see that this is a very interesting transformation of Bangladesh, because from 1975 to 1990, when Bangladesh was a civilian, was a military authoritarian regime, it transformed. Usually, in many instances, we have seen this transformation gradual. But in case of Bangladesh, it is a quick jump to electoral democracy. What is the marker of those electoral democracy? First of all, regular elections, fair election, commitment to the power of the legislative body, and definitely the freedom of expression as much possible, and independent judiciary. Not all institutions were functioning well. Nevertheless, it started in 1991. Thereafter, I say that it has started to regress. Between 1991 and 2006, what we have seen is the semi-authoritarianism or competitive authoritarianism. So, what I mean by semi-authoritarianism is that increasingly the power of the prime minister was so, the way it was exercised because of the constitution. Constitution provided enormous power to the prime minister, and prime minister, irrespective of who was in power. First, between 1991 and 96, it was Khaleda Zia of Bangladesh Nationalist Party who was in power. She, and later, when in 1996, Sheikh Hasina of Bangladesh Awami League came into power, what we have seen, increasingly the power became concentrated in the office of the prime minister and prime minister per se. Though they were exercising their power constitutionally, it actually gave them so much power that they could decide both in terms of their parties, respective parties, and the government by individual. So the power grab of this whole situation have created an environment which can be called as semi-authoritarianism. But it is also competitive authoritarianism in the sense that the competitive authoritarianism means that both, political parties, in this case, in case of Bangladesh, both political parties has the support base within the populace. And we have seen in case of election, 1991, 96, and 2000 election, clearly showed that these two political parties have almost equal support base. Power alternated between Awami League and BNP. So this electoral authoritarianism led to an impasse, political impasse in 2006, as I have mentioned, that led to the intervention, and then came this electoral, this election in 2008, the rise of, or the victory of Awami League. Subsequently, between 2009 and 2019, I call it as electoral authoritarianism, because increasingly what we saw during this period is the degradation of the democratic institution. Many of these institutions were weak to begin with, and then it started to erode. And then came this, period where we have seen that increasingly the elections are becoming manipulated. So what are the distinctive features between 1991 and 2001? As I have explained in the next slide, that a competitive multi-party political system with universal adult suffrage and regularly contested election promised during the pro-democracy movement between 1982 and 1990 was coming to fruition. However, there was a vibrant civil society. Independence of judiciary, although remained elusive, but at least there was a promise of it. In 1996, one thing that happened is the inclusion of a caretaker government provision. What is the caretaker government provision? Due to the trust deficit between these two political parties, it was agreed upon that the election will be held under a caretaker government which would not contest, which would be a non-partisan technocratic government. In 1991, 1996, both these elections, in 1991 and 1996, both these elections were held under the caretaker government. In 1995-96, Awami League insisted that it should be included in the constitution and subsequent elections should be held under this caretaker government. It was included. But also we have seen the erosion at this point, especially after 1996, because as I have said, that an all-powerful prime ministerial system began to flourish. That means the prime minister had enormous power. So what we saw is the erosion. So in next slide, what I have explained that this erosions begin in the 2000s. The system descended into a semi-authoritarian system and a competitive authoritarianism. What are the indicators of those? First of all is the manipulation of election itself. As we have seen, Bangladesh Nationalist Party in 1996 in an election in February, before the caretaker government was incorporated into the constitution, they tried to manipulate the election through changes in the constitution. Victory in the election became the primary thing instead of making sure that the popular participation and expression of will of the people are highlighted. So manipulation of the constitution is one of the key elements of this democratic erosion. 14th Amendment of Bangladesh Constitution, which was done by the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, was done in order to extend the tenure of the judges. Why? Because the judges, Chief Justice, the immediate past Chief Justice, would have led the caretaker government which would oversee the election. It is alleged that the BNP was doing this manipulation of constitution, particularly the 14th Amendment, was intended to make sure that a former Chief Justice who is sympathetic to BNP, Bangladesh Nationalist Party, would be heading the caretaker government. That is what created this impasse. That is what created this political, kind of situation wherein the military had the opportunity to step in. So the military-backed government continued for 2 years, and then what happened in 2009? Someone is asking for the slide. I don't have the slides with me right now because of the change of this technological problem. So could you please move on to the next slide? That from 2009 to 2022, between 2009 and 2019, what happened is in May 2011, there was a court verdict that says the caretaker government, which was instituted and included in the Constitution through 13th Amendment, the court verdict was called it as null and void and unconstitutional. So the court, however, made an observation: the next 2 elections should be held under the caretaker government. That is, non-party, technocratic government which would not participate in election. However, in 2011, using this court verdict as a pretext, what the Awami League government did, they changed the constitution again. That is the 15th Amendment in June 2011. It scrapped the caretaker government altogether. What happened if you remove the caretaker provision? That means the incumbent government would basically oversee the election. What we have seen previously, that in case of Bangladesh, between 1973 until 2001, all the elections that have taken place, that is in 1973, 1979, 1986, 1988, all elections that took place under the partisan government have been manipulated by the incumbent government and that had delivered victory to the whoever is in power, because they could use the election commission, they could use the civilian administration, they could use the law enforcement agencies in support of them. That's why the caretaker government was actually demanded and installed and included in the constitution. Nevertheless, with the inclusion of 15th Amendment, that is the completely taking away the caretaker provision, that means the incumbent government would oversee the election. Opposition demanded that it should be restored, that the caretaker provisions. The incumbent Awami League declined to do so, and this is within this context the 2014 election took place. It was boycotted by all the opposition except those which support or part of the ruling alliance. It delivered a victory for understandable reason, because there is no contestation whatsoever. As a matter of fact, this is a very interesting election, because even before the election started, 153, that is more than half of the parliament members, were elected unopposed. Even a single vote was cast. Bangladesh parliament has 300 members. So when there 153 were elected without any opposition, even before a single vote was cast, basically a majority was ensured. But in any case, there was no opposition. Hence, Awami League won a major victory with more than three-fourths of the seats by one party alone. And there was no opposition whatsoever. It is the same pattern that we have seen in 2018, despite the demand that elections are held under the caretaker government. The opposition, the ruling party didn't agree to it, and they didn't make any changes. So the 2018 election happened. Opposition did participate. So what happened in 2018 election? Despite the fact of the opposition's participation, Awami League ensured a victory, and that is where I call the transformation of electoral authoritarianism. As I have explained in this next slide, the electoral authoritarian regime they held the multi-party election, regular election of the chief executive, but violates the basic understanding of the democracy. What are those? For example, principles of freedom and fairness. The election was not fair. Increasingly, what we saw is the demise of the space for democratic participation. The election was so fraudulently conducted that economists described it as transparently fraudulent. So the elections become the instrument of authoritarian rule rather than the expression of the people or an instrument of democracy. Andreas Schadler, in his book, Electoral Authoritarianism, The Dynamics of Unfree Competition, has explained it extensively, drawing on other cases, which was published in 2006. 2018 election, and particularly what happened in Bangladesh between 2014 and 2018, and subsequently what we have seen, that the logic of electoral authoritarianism is the one where we have seen this effort to ensure that the incumbent wins the election. So what happened in Bangladesh between 1991 and 2002 is basically instead of an electoral democracy in 1991, as I have tried to explain in a picture, in a figure in next slides, that the electoral democracy has increasingly became an instrument of electoral authoritarianism. So what are these stages? The stages, as I've said, this is the process that we have seen, but there are particular steps that have been taken by the incumbent. What are those? To draw on those, to understand the steps taken by the government with respect to this democratic backsliding, or which contributed to this democratic backsliding, is I have taken, this is the second point that I'm making, what are the stages, how it has been done. One of the major studies so far done globally is by Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, their book, How Democracies Die. In that book, as I have seen shown in the next slide, the stages of backsliding. They have said that there are 3 stages. What are those 3 stages? The first stage is targeting the referees of the state. That means the judiciary, the law enforcement, tax, and regulation agencies are controlled by the incumbent, and those are used by the government to persecute the opposition. They ensure the loyalty of these institutions, so the incumbent can protect, the government, ruling party, and the leader, and attack the opponents. So their understanding is the first, the referees. What are those? The judiciary, the law enforcement. The second stage is targeting the opponents of the government. So the political opponents, the critical media, business leaders, all are then persecuted in various fashion. They are demoralized, they are weakened. And the third stage, according to Levitsky and Ziblatt, is the change of the rules of governing. That is the legislative changes, the constitutional changes, and electoral system. This has been the, according to Levitsky and Ziblatt, that has been the one. That has been the one. That is the process that has unfolded elsewhere. They have the generalized one. What I did in case of Bangladesh, I think that this ordering of these stages has changed. As I have shown in my next slide, that in case of Bangladesh, the entire process actually started with the change, the rules of the government. So when how did the legislation, constitution, and electoral system? In case of Bangladesh, the removal of the caretaker government in 2011, the caretaker provision which enabled to have a free and fair election was removed from the constitution, and hence it was the incumbent who were basically supervising the election. They have this capacity, or the constitution allowed to have this. So I consider that as the first step of this backsliding that has been institutionalized. That is the change of the rules of the government. So that is the one which Ziblatt and Levitsky was talking about, the third stage. I am suggesting in case of Bangladesh, that was the first stage through the changes in the constitution, particularly with the 15th Amendment of the Constitution. That process actually began to unfold. The second one is the targeting of the opponents, the political opponents, critical media, and institutions. In 2013, there has been a law which was introduced. The law was introduced in 2006, but it was amended in 2013, which allowed the government to have enormous power to clamp down on the opposing media and social media particularly. Also, they have targeted opposition, means they started filing cases. In many cases, those are frivolous cases. We have seen those, the bribery, blackmail, and these are the methods, charging opponents with invented or exaggerated criminal activities. Those are the things that have happened. We have seen these frivolous cases. Amendment of the law called Information and Communication Technology, which was introduced in 2006, but 2013 amendment gave enormous power to the government. The third stage in case of Bangladesh was targeting the referee of the state, that is the judiciary. And this is done through another constitutional amendment that is called the 16th Amendment was brought in when the Chief Justice, then Chief Justice, actually nullified those. He was, according to his own admission or statement, what he claimed, he was hounded, he was forced into resignation, and he was exiled. In his book, he insisted that he was forced out of the power because he opposed the 16th Amendment, which gave power to the legislative bodies, that is the political part of the government, to remove any justices. That it apparently looks that it is fine. It is going to the popular representative. But what happens, it becomes subjected to the popular will or the party's wish. So are these the only thing? No, those are not the only thing. In the next one, what I've seen, there are 3 things, there are those 3 elements that we can see which are enormously, reflective of the increasing authoritarian tendency. In the next slide, I have talked about the enforced disappearances. That is, the state actors have been engaged in picking up people, and they remain completely disappeared or missing. The number has grown significantly in the previous year. One of the things is that in case of 2018 election, right before the election, throughout the whole year, there have been 98 people who have been picked up. Their families, their friends alleged that they have been picked up by the plainclothes police or law enforcement agency, particularly an elite organization or elite unit of the Bangladesh police called Rapid Action Battalion has been engaged in it. And that is what led to the sanctions against them. In 2021, United States has imposed sanctions on the Rapid Action Battalion. Among those charges that they have brought is the violation of human rights, particularly engaged in enforced disappearance and extrajudicial killing. And that is what the extrajudicial killing, that is without any kind of legal process, often people have been killed. As I have shown in my next slide, that the number has grown over time, significantly. 2018, again, if you look at the election year in 2018, there have been 466 cases where people were killed without any legal recourse. Government claim that these were encounters. In some cases, they're calling it gunfight. They're calling it, in various names. But essentially, if you look at 2 years of this chart, in 2013, prior to the election of 2014 and 2018, right on the election year, this spike of these extrajudicial killings are enormous. That means the government, either in the name of war against drugs, they are practically creating a culture of fear. People were afraid. And that has influenced how people speak, what they speak about, and practically that has silenced or created a enormous fear that people tend to remain silent. But also it has provided impunity to those who have been engaged in this kind of thing. The state actors, that is law enforcement agencies, have not been held accountable for this kind of extrajudicial killing or alleged the enforced disappearance. But these are the ones that we have seen in case of enforced disappearance, in case of extrajudicial killing. The culture of fear was also created through another means. And in my next slide, I talk about a law called Digital Security Act. Digital Security Act came into being in 2018, October, 2 months before the election. What it does, it gives absolute power to the government to initiate investigation into anyone whose activities are considered as a threat to the government. So even the suspicion itself is sufficient enough to arrest someone. Crimes that has, in this law, the crimes have been vaguely defined, so vaguely defined that it can be interpreted in many ways. Anyone, law enforcement agencies can arrest anybody without warrant. They can search any premise without any probable cause, or even they do not need the warrant. That the suspicion, a police unit, that something is there in my computer at my home at certain point might trigger a search and an arrest, and also seize anything they want. And my computer, my laptop, my telephone, that can be seized. Anyone can file those. So what means that anyone can file a charge against anybody going to any police station is pretty much a vigilante justice. Because what happens if someone doesn't like me, if my neighbor doesn't like me, or someone in Bangladesh, he or she can just walk into a police station and says that I have done some crime. What kind of crime? That I posted a comment that is critical of the government. That is sufficient enough for police to show up at the doorstep and arrest lawfully. Police are doing it lawfully because the Digital Security Act has given them this enormous power. The government can remove and block any information or data on the internet, what it means, it deems necessary. If the government thinks that a website run by XYZ has something that is described as critical of the government or derogatory to the ministers, or even described as threat to the state or the government, they can actually block it, and they have done it. So out of the 20 provisions of this case, there are 14 of them. If you're charged with those, you would not get a bail from the court. It remains the discretion of the court if they want to give you bail. 5 are available, and 1 is pretty much bail. This non-bailable provision of the law practically have allowed those who are accused to be in pre-trial detention for months and months and months. Although it says that it would be, anyone charged with this law, the police will have to provide report within 90 days or so. But what happened? Hardly that is the case. So who are the victims? I'm saying that this law is bad, but who are the victims? I've done a study on the Center for Governance Studies in Bangladesh that we have looked into this Digital Security Act. In my next slide, I've provided some of the data from that. Who are the victims? From January 2020 until February 2022, over this period, there have been 2,244 cases that we could identify. I mean, individuals who have been accused. We have identified 890 cases. And look, this is after 2 years. It started in October 2018 until it became so pervasive, so widely used, so widely abused, so to speak, that it became a threat to the freedom of expression. So over 26 months, we have seen that mostly it has become the 26 months accused have been average 86, 32, 34 cases. Most of them are journalists and politicians. 802 journalists have been accused under this. So what are these things? What does that mean? In my next slide, what I say is that it is not only this institutional changes, what has happened, beyond an institution, these things have been ideologically wrapped around. And so much so that it tends to be a situation where speaking out against government has become a threat to your own safety. The political parties are now pretty much in the fear culture. So if I go to the last one of my slides, the where to, if you look at this, there will be an election in 2023. We don't know whether it would be a repeat. And most importantly, the Battlefield Transformation Index is calling Bangladesh as a moderate autocracy. Where does Bangladesh go from here? That is my question. Is it en route to authoritarianism? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Riaz, for the very interesting and insightful talk. May I now invite my colleague, Professor Hiroyuki Yamamoto, for his comments before I open the floor for a Q&A session. Professor Yamamoto.
Okay, well, Professor Riaz, very nice to meet you, and thank you very much for coming
Thank you.
Giving us the opportunity to learn from you. We TIU have many students from Bangladesh, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. We all have a very keen interest in this issue. And plus, I teach comparative politics, and in the second half of the semester, we'll be talking about democracy and backsliding. So this is very a great opportunity for all of us. You want to think that I have read your paper in 2020 on this issue, and one of the things that I found really impressive and interesting was that you applied the Levitsky's and Ziblatt's processes to this country, and I found out that processes actually, the order of the process was actually not exactly as Levitsky predicted it. It was actually changing rules that came first, and then suppressing opponents and controlling institutions. So that was actually very important in refining Levitsky's argument. So I think that was pretty impressive. And also, I like the fact that you combine the institutional elements and the non-institutional elements. And that's something that I haven't seen anybody done this. So I learned a great deal from this. One thing that made me really curious was the differences between processes and causes. The processes of backsliding seems to be very good indicators of democratic backsliding. But I can't help but think that maybe there are perhaps deeper causes of these processes. I think that you mentioned in the article that the partyarchy, which means that the excessive vicious polarization between the two parties, seems to be the crux of the problem. And me being a historical materialist, I tend to seek causes of polarization in society, and I look for regional cleavages, religious cleavages, urban, rural cleavages, and so on. So I just wonder that if there are any social bases of this polarization between the AL and the B and P. That's my first question. Should I go on?
Yes, please.
Okay. And the second also could be that the electoral system, the first past the post, which means that the single member district system seems to be conducive to vicious competition between the parties. And Japan in 1920s faced a similar fate. They introduced this electoral system led to too much battle between two parties, which eventually led to the intervention by the military. And that was the beginning of the democratic backslide. So I find it really fascinating to find similarities between Bangladesh right now and Japan in the 1920s. And so that's my first question. The second question is there any hope, which sounds very pessimistic, but I found that the current predicament is really severe and serious. And I was hoping that maybe there are some signs of a student protest movement or something that we have seen in December 1990, once again. And maybe the soft coup that you described by the military to put a stop to this endless democratic backsliding by the AL. I'm not sure if there are any hope left. I hope to find some hope in this predicament. That's my second question. Well, I have another one, but that's rather minor. So let me stop here.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Yamamoto, for your comments and questions. Professor Riaz, would you like to respond to Professor Yamamoto briefly before
Sure.
we move on to the Q&A session?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Professor Yamamoto, for your kind comments, and particularly reading it so carefully. I'm delighted to see that the issues are getting attention, because I see Bangladesh as a case. On the one hand, the Bangladesh is unique in the sense how it has moved, but it is not unique also because the democratic backsliding is taking place elsewhere. That's why I've tried to look into the processes. This paper, particularly today's presentation about these processes, that's why I've not looked or delved into the causes. And absolutely, I've referred to, briefly alluded to the partyarchy, how the party system has worked, and how there's this vicious polarization that we have seen, pernicious polarization that we've seen, because of this idea that the party should be above all, and the impunity that is provided to the party activists. And that has happened since 1990, even before, but since 1990, it has increasingly becoming the mainstay of politics. So I agree with you that partyarchy is one of the reasons. And definitely the electoral system, that winner takes all kind of situation, creates this enormous importance to the election, that by any means you'll have to win it, because the cost of defeat is very high. That is another thing. That is the cost of defeat. Once you are out of power, how you are treated. In case of Bangladesh, what we have seen, those who are in opposition has been persecuted by those who are incumbent in such a manner that they became a competition of vengeance, so to speak. That what do you do? When you go to power, you try to take on your opponents. So the winner takes all, first past the post system has contributed to this polarization immensely. But I also want to add to that the constitutional element of it. Bangladesh moved from presidential system to parliamentary system. It was a welcome development in 1991 because the presidential system from 75 to 1990 actually was not good for them. Power was concentrated in single. But then the transformation took place in such a manner that the constitution provided enormous power, and there's very few checks and balances. So if the constitution had shared the power and ensured perhaps a time limit of the prime ministers, or the prime minister cannot be also the party head of the party, those type of things could have been checks and balances. And also in Bangladesh constitution, which I have not discussed because it doesn't relate to in some Article 70, which that is anti-defection law, but it has been used to practically keep the party members, parliament members, in a very short leash. Even short leash is an exaggerated statement. They have no independence whatsoever, to speak. So the parliament has become, in a sense, an instrument where it just gets the rubber stamp, and the prime minister has enormous power. Then you have this system where this, past post and winner takes all. All of them comes to create this kind of authoritarianism. It creates, and then you have this trust deficit between these two political parties. And there are reasons. When BNP was in power, there was an attack on Sheikh Hasina. She was almost assassinated. And then when BNP Awami League is in power, now as we see that Khaleda Zia has been in jail on a very dubious draft charges. So all these things contributed. Final point is there a hope? I'm very much optimistic, because in 1982 to 1990, a lot of, people thought that this is going to be for decades, military rule. But there is a popular uprising. And I expect that, on the one hand, hope against hope, is the current government should understand that there is a way out for reintroducing the politics, creating space, having an inclusive political system, because it's not good. Non-inclusive political system is not good for economy either. I mean, as we speak, what is happening in Sri Lanka should gives us a clear lesson that even Sri Lanka, which has been doing very well economically until recently, but the absence of an inclusive politics and authoritarianism has resulted in this kind of situation. I hope Bangladesh doesn't get into that kind of thing. So I'm optimistic that the Bangladeshi people would actually find out a way to address this. They have done it in 1971. They have established a country. In 1990, they have created a democratic system. Through the elections, they have expressed their will on 91, 2001, 96, and so on and so forth, 2008. So let's hope.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Professor Riaz, for your insightful responses. Now I will open the floor for questions. I would like to request you to identify yourself briefly before asking the questions. We received a question from one of our TIU students, Syed Jadid. He is asking the question about your opinion on the social movement, for example, like the students' movement, and quoting some comments from Vice Chancellor in one of the universities in Bangladesh. And he's asking why the current regime is very rude to students, especially.
See, it is not only against the students. Basically, the underlying mode of governance in Bangladesh has become very coercive, repressive. You know, any sign of dissent is seen as a threat to the regime's viability or regime's resilience, so to speak, or regime's existence. So that is why, and the students have a long history of creating quote unquote trouble for the governments. Let us not forget, 1990 movement was spearheaded by the by the students. And the 1990 movement's students' role seems to create a sort of fear. That's why all the social movements, whether anti-quota movement or the anti-VC movement, all things are seen in such a light that it is a threat. But that is because of the absence of the politics itself. Space is so constrained, no one can speak.
Okay, thank you for your response. Our students have some questions from this classroom. Ilkom, do you have questions? Could you introduce yourself briefly?
Good morning, Professor. My name is Ilkom, and I'm from Uzbekistan, which is located in Central Asia. The topic, actually, I really like it, and I try to read and learn about the situation in Bangladesh and learn from some source from the internet. And actually, I came across some informations. I'm not sure whether it's true or not. I want to ask you this question. And the people actually of the Bangladesh, especially the international affairs advisor, whose name is Gohar Rizvi, and these people are actually explaining the situation which is happening in the Bangladesh. They're trying kind of showing that they are doing some work and they are improving the situation. And when it comes to the freedom of speech, one of the activists named Shahidul Alam, and I think that he is the friend of that person. He was kind of jailed because what he wanted is just to express and to explain the situation to the world. But they are just claiming that it's not something, it's like what he did, it was misinformation, and that's why we actually arrested him. He's saying. And can you explain us whether those people, I mean the international affairs advisor and some other high commissioner to UK, they're claiming that they're doing well and they're bringing some developments in Bangladesh, like the economical growth and the extreme poverty rate. And is it all about like to justify themselves? I'm not sure. And can you answer this question, please?
Okay, thank you, Ilkom. Professor Riaz, sorry, we have a couple of more questions from the students.
Okay, let's take all of those questions and respond.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
I cannot hear. Perhaps the microphone is not on. Excuse me. Unfortunately, I'm not hearing you anything. Could you either speak? I think the microphone is not working or something of that kind.
Okay. Do you hear?
Hello?
Do you hear him now?
Go ahead, please.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yeah, now I can hear you.
Okay.
Okay, so my name is Saida Hanjati and I'm from Bangladesh. So my question is that you said that you are very optimistic about the thing that people will revolt again, but I'm actually curious that there is no such alternative, better alternative than League, or like the alternative we have like BNP or like Jamaat Islam. So I'm very curious about the rise of Jamaat Islam again, the fundamentalist Islamist party in Bangladesh, which they were actually against of our liberation war in 1971. So I'm curious that they are now getting, like they are actually very active on the growth level. So they are recruiting members like high school students or university students. They are funding them and they're getting the international fund instead of like looking at refugee camps. So they are collecting funds from international level by saying that we are helping the Rohingya refugee. But actually, this kind of funds are actually using for the organizational purpose. So, what is your thought about that? Again, is there any chance of rise of this fundamentalist Islamic party in Bangladesh again?
Okay, good. Thank you. We have one more question. Could you pass the mic to the student there? Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
So my name is Bondi Siddiq and I'm from Bangladesh. And you were talking about like optimistic and also about the fact that how much control and manipulation is there, which like when I hear about it, it reminds me of totalitarianism. And I was thinking if you told that like Bangladesh has like once done and like went for democracy, which I felt like which was very short-lived after, especially after the independence of Bangladesh. How is it? I'm wondering how is there like how is it any possible way of like that changing because of the amount of control? Because here people cannot really go against the government because people has like under all manipulation. I'm also guessing that the manipulation is not only in the security or only there, it's inside. And it's very to the core where no matter which government comes up, it has a trace of the previous government. So I am basically my question is there actually a very like optimistic way of seeing it? Because or this will be just another manipulation we see, but more at public level, even we will be manipulated basically. That, oh, this is, I guess, because as a Bangladeshi, for me to know that so many, like how early the democracy went away is very shocking because for a long time I thought that it was for a long time it was democracy, which meant that it was not very open. The idea of it being like authoritarian or like competitive authoritarian. So which makes me feel like if there will be, I know that there is not much of a like pure democracy, but I wonder if we will ever go close or because we already have the illusion of kind of like having democracy. So I wonder if it will just be just extension of it.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much for your interesting question. Professor Riaz, may I add maybe last question?
Sure.
Yes. Well, institutions or political institutional change, like in elections, are obviously very important indicators but I believe how institutions are structured within what kind of ideas, like what you pointed out in one of your, points, the PowerPoint slide, and also briefly Professor Yamamoto mentioned, and also how institutions are implemented are very important indicators to explain the democratic backsliding. So I'm wondering how the ideas of national leaders evolved from the caretaker government to the current government under the electoral authoritarianism. So did the national leaders support the norms and values of democracy? Or how do the national leaders understand democracy? Thank you.
Thank you, Sojin. Let me try to go through these 4 questions that I have. I may not do justice to your question because that actually is another paper that I should write.
I see. Okay.
but I will try to respond. Let me start with the first question with respect to the Shahidul Alam's arrest and Gauri's response to it. The first point is that worst thing has happened since Shahidul Alam's agonizing days in detention. Mushtaq Ahmed, a social activist and author, an entrepreneur, has died in jail when he was while he was detained under Digital Security Act for 10 months. 10 months he was in jail. Court denied 6 times to his bail, and eventually he died. He was arrested in May 2020. Died last year in February 25th, I guess, if I recall it correctly. Along with him was another cartoonist, Kishore, who was arrested. He later released and filed a case. When he was detained, he was tortured. And he said that Mushtaq was tortured. Government claimed there wasn't, but why suddenly someone would die? And visibly, when Kishore was released, he was visibly, had signs of being tortured. So even Mr. Gauri might claim that he's Shahidul's friend. I don't know whether they're friends. That's not the point. The point is there is not misinformation. Had this been misinformation, why not the correct information can actually provide it? Government has all the apparatuses to provide the correct information. Instead, persecuting someone, arrested, allegedly torturing, creating a situation where you cannot speak. Is that what is the way to deal with this? Would we prefer to do that one? No, we would not. Whether it's in Bangladesh or in Japan, no. Neither it is unless we are in, of course, in Syria or North Korea. So the development argument that Bangladesh is being developed, first of all, it's not only the government's credit to this. Second is even as we speak, for the last years, there have been serious questions with respect to the statistics provided by the government with respect to GDP growth. It doesn't matter up we have seen this kind of situation. Sri Lanka's GDP growth was enormous until it actually fell flat. So this development argument that for the sake of the development you have to give up. Development is not only infrastructure development. Development means human rights, participation. Had that not been the case, then Bangladesh wouldn't have become independent. Between 1958 and 1969, military ruler has done quite impressive quote-unquote development in Pakistan. Why then Bangladesh is actually fought in 69 popular uprising and 71 war? To have an inclusive society, social justice. So that's not the argument that we can actually butt it. If it is misinformation, provide the information to the people to let them make their decision. To the second point, that if there's an alternative, it has to be Jamaat. Why? So a fair election would actually elect Jamaat. Last 4 elections doesn't Data doesn't support it. The highest vote Jamaat has ever received was what, 10%, 11%? 30% was BNP, 31% was Awami League. So just because someone might win, we should actually suspend the election. And speaking out, Jamaat Islami is not an alternative, not to the public. It participated in 4 elections. As a matter of fact, since 1979, it has been participating in election. Why this fear has been created that Jamaat Islami would come to power? That does not mean that does not justify taking away the rights of the people, which is enshrined in the Bangladesh constitution and international law, that I cannot or you cannot speak. It is the right of the people to speak. So is there a better alternative? My point is not better alternative. My point is the participation. In a fair election, when BNP won in 1991, Awami League won in 1996, BNP won in 2001, Awami League won in 2006. I have no problem. I have no problem. I do not carry anyone's water. You said all these things. I don't know where you get those data. Perhaps you have, but that's not the point. The point is, insofar as democracy is concerned, it cannot be suspended just because of the fear. Would I suggest that in next election, there is a valid reason, there is this understanding that Mr. Trump might come back to power. God forbid it, hope it would not happen. But should then Biden administration cancel that next election, presidential election? Would you support that? Alternative would be created from within the public. Give them the option. And if no alternative, if they choose Awami League again with 2/3, 3/4, 4/5, in a fair election, whatever party wins. Everyone should accept that. 91, BNP won. 96, Awami League won. Everyone accepted. So it's not about suddenly don't create this fear that there will be Jamaat. There will be. Data doesn't support it. Creating this fear and justifying an authoritarian regime, taking away the fundamental right for which Bangladesh was created. Had the Pakistani government accepted 1970s election, Bangladesh war wouldn't have taken place. Millions of people have laid down their lives for protecting the right to vote. And the verdict they have given in 1970 election. Sheikh Mujibur Rahman won that election, and he was the legitimate leader of Bangladesh. He had a legitimate claim on the Pakistan's power. When it was denied, Bangladeshis fought for it. Basis of that was 1970s fair election. Let us not forget it. Optimism. The third point is that optimism. Where do I find the optimism? Yes, in some ways, the way it has been constrained, there's reason to be very much pessimistic. I understand it. I've worked on the Digital Security Act for the last 2 years, that I've seen very across how fear has permeated society. Everyone is afraid, even to speak up, even to say, comment or express their like or dislike in social media. But it is in many instances, people have said that this is not going to happen. This is not going to happen. It happens. I hope that through constitutional means, through a fair participatory election, through an inclusive political system, Bangladesh would make the changes or keep the status quo. It doesn't matter. If majority of Bangladeshis want to keep the status quo, so be it. That I hope is there reason to be concerned? I am concerned, but I'm still optimistic because I still believe that at the end of the day, people tend to take the right decision. Bangladeshis did make the right decision in 1971, 1990. They made the right decision. They rightly dislodged BNP from power in 1996 because they didn't like it. That is the point. Democracy is the only system where you can make a mistake and correct it. You don't have to go to the history. Let us look at the United States. Various ways, various kind of system might have produced Mr. Trump. But then again, he was dislodged from the power through democracy. Democracy is the only system that allows you to make a mistake and correct it. Neither this one-party system allows that, nor any other kind of political system that I know of, which would allow you to make the mistake and correct it.
Great, Professor. Thank you very much, Professor Riaz, for your excellent talk and engagement. We truly enjoyed learning from you today. I hope Bangladesh can navigate the route to democracy well from the next elections. Thank you all for your participation today. In our next TIU Global Dialogue session, we'll spotlight Sri Lanka's domestic politics and international relations by inviting Dr. Julani Atanayak. And another session will discuss China's New World Order by having my colleague, Professor Hagen Lee, with his recent book publication. Please stay tuned. Thank you very much.